Well, my name is Eloisa Diaz, and I am part of this collective organization, La Sandía Digital, or the Digital Watermelon. And we work in three things: communication, audio and visual production, and training. Our working access, they have to do with land and territory, with women voices, with human rights, and community cinema. Hello, hello, everybody that is saying here hello. It's a pleasure to have you here in this talk. Um, in my experience, this has to do with communication. My first space has been the community communication. So my specialty is actually in that point, in different communication processes, collectives, participation, and collaborations. From there is where we're going to be able to share the experience of how to think and transform narratives. I'm a migrant. I've been living in Mexico for 20 years. I lived and was born in Argentina. And because of a personal situation, personal search, and because I had family here in Mexico, I came to this country and where I was received very well, and I've been here living for a long time already. So, in order to talk about narratives, I would like to talk about communication first. How do we understand communication? Everything that I'm going to share with you in this talk actually has to do with thinking about communication from a own agenda. There are different practices and different ways to think about communication, and all of them may be valid, but each of them answer to different needs. There is a firefighting communication, so that is this communication that is answering or responding to and reacting to what is happening in social network, in communities, etc. But there is another way of communication that has to do to answering to the context, not only to that space that may be closer from our audience and for our group, but also to this other political and social context. And there is another way to conceive and to work about communication, and this has to do with the communication from your own agenda. To think about communication on the long term, and this has exactly to do to have clear a political vision. Many times, the organizations, of course, we have a political vision, and this is not always shared within the organization. This is not valid most of the time. So actually this could answer to other moment, to other context, to other objectives, etc. So talking about communication from your own agenda will mean to review and update this political vision. Means to defend and to advocate and also to construct the fights of the organizations what we want to change in a desired future. And this obviously has to do with our visions of the world, with our perspectives of the world, what we want to share with the people with which we're working, whether within the organization, in alliances, or those groups that are following up us because we may create dialogues and we are in constant communication. So, thinking about communication in these terms is talking about strategic communication, and it's very trendy right now to talk about strategic communication. It is repeated even for the movements, and in many cases, this will seem as something mandatory. We need to do strategic communication, and this demand comes from different places. Of course, we are doing communication from the organizations, but the question is how organized and planned and coordinated with our objectives, with our strategic objectives, is this communication. Ask ourselves the communication in our organization, in which moment is it? Is it a firefighting communication? Is it answering to the context? Or is in this moment of the communication in which what we do in terms of this will align with our change objectives, with our communication objectives, with also that we want to transform from the bottom. So this is what communication is about, the strategy. And this means different steps. It means a complete practice, and we're not going to stop here. I wanted to actually start talking that this is our starting point of this communication, of this session. As the workshop title says, this is a communication and change of narratives. And narratives is another trendy word. This is a word that is also repeated a lot, and in many cases, it's used as a synonym. And we're not always talking about the same when we say this new word. So, first of all, I would like to define narratives here in La Sandía Digital, and from this diagnosis and from these conversations with more than 100 people, we defined narratives as thinking structures, as models that allow us to think and that allow us especially to tell the story, to communicate. So these structures, these narrative structures, and why we say structures and not topics, those are thinking structures that usually have topics, characters, as we may want to call them, that are going to be related in a certain manner by means of certain facts, so different situations, events, and they're going to give a space for an argument, to an explanation of the world. As I was saying, we were working a lot on the advocacy of the land, and in that case, one of the big narratives from the hegemonic discourses is progress, well-being, development. Those are three narratives that are installing. I mean, when we talk from there, we're talking about certain vision of the world, certain explanation of the world, certain development, certain manner to understand how we walk and how the communities and the communities grow. This is talking about narratives. But then what are stories? If the narratives are structure of thoughts that are gonna organize us, I mean, it's gonna be very different to talk about from the development that from the good living. Those are different perspectives, and they will have different visions of the world. And the stories are different tellings that are told in a personal manner, and they could be collective or individual. We can talk about the property of the stories, and stories may tell a particular intention, a particular event of certain characters or just one character. People do not tell narratives, people tell stories. But there is another word that in communication, and I wanted to also make this distinction between narrative stories and messages, because it's very easy that we get confused about the definition of each of these words. But the messages, hello to everybody has joined. We have started, but please, any comment or any question, I'm very attentive and willing to read you. So if you want to comment on something that I am saying, you are totally welcome. So messages. What do we understand by messages? Messages is just a piece of this narrative. The narrative will give us the full vision of the world, but then in a video, in a cardboard, I cannot share all this vision. It's very difficult. So it's very probable that we need to divide this narrative in little messages that may be appropriate for the people that we want to reach and for the reason we want to convey this information. So those are narratives that are messages that are going to convey concrete information. It could be cardboards or videos. There is a lot of ways to share these messages. And these videos are looking to produce an effect in terms of achieving a type of reaction. Preferably, we will look for a transformational reaction to transform the way of thinking, the action, the way of naming something. We're looking for an effect to that something could happen as soon as we start sharing these messages. Those are very clear, simple texts that are very easy to receive by the audiences. We're not thinking about abstract concepts, and they are constructed in a very key manner, very closely to the profile of the people with which we want to talk. I do not build up messages just for all the public, for a general public. To do this, of course, it's going to have certain impact or certain effect. But in reality, every audience, every group of audience, every stakeholder of the communication has different visions, arguments, and experiences. So if we start or we go out from these experiences, obviously the messages are going to be different. They need to be adequate. They need to answer or respond to the place and to the context, to the audience group. Sometimes audience, the word audience is very cold, but I'm talking about groups or sectors or communities with a very defined profile, which is their age, what are they doing for a living, which are their dreams, where they are living, what they are looking for. So those are the questions that we can ask to the profile of our audience. In this little introduction, actually, I have certain key elements. Objective. And this will always be our guideline. What do we want to achieve? Not with the communication, but what do we want to achieve with our organization? I understand that you work from organizations that are working in terms of migration in different spaces, in different manners, but with migrants. What do you want to achieve? Which is your future vision, the world vision. This what you want to transform, achieve, or change. This will always be the guideline for the communication. And then the other messages, the other key words that are being joined here is objective, narrative, messages, and audience. We cannot separate one from the other. So all the messages are talking or expressing certain narrative. Every message are going to be directed to certain audience. Hi from Cafe Min. It's very good to have you here, Valeria. Actually, as part of this presentation, I will share with you the process that we are having from La Sandía Digital with Cafe Min, especially for the podcast creation for migrants. So it is a pleasure to have you here, Valeria. So key elements. We cannot separate these key elements. So Benjamin was saying that the key acknowledgement is the respect to the human rights for everybody, including migrants. Okay, Benjamin, if you are telling me that the objective, this is your vision, how can you imagine this future of the people, the migrants? What would happen to them? How do they live if they actually, if you could achieve this actually? Maybe you can write it on the chat and we can read it later and I will retake this topic. But I would love you to share with us about your objectives and visions. Because visions and objectives, and this is very important, we want to work with communication, we need to land them in. We could have this general and abstract idea, but whenever I need to keep on building messages to define the profile of my audience, to identify the narrative from which I want to talk, we need to have embodied this objective, to have evidence, to have experience, because then it will be easier to identify with whom we want to talk and what we want to say. So, as I was saying, those are four elements that we cannot separate. It's same narrative, it's going to be translated into different messages according to the audiences that our communication actions are addressing, and also to the objective that they are looking to contribute. So, for example, this one, the state role needs to warranty roof, a remunerated job, and health education so that workers do not need to migrate. Perfect. This is an objective that we can start visualizing and actually to start making little stories in different actions and in concrete situations, in precise situations. Thank you, Benjamin. We're going to go back once again to this part. So, I don't know if there is any question or comment here about this distinction between narrative, message, audience, communication. Is there any question about this so that I can go completely and fully to the narrative topic? Okay. So I know that there is a little delay. Benjamin is completing this objective by saying, so for workers do not need to migrate, and if they need to migrate, they recognize their personality without any distinctions, and that they are not criminalized. So here we have a lot of elements that for sure we'll need to look for and analyze in order to see from which narratives we're going to tell this story, from which narratives we're going to talk about this objective, because this is a vision of the world about the relationship between people, about dignity of the people, about the way we want to live. Exactly. In this case, and that's very good to know, Benjamin. Thank you very much. From the fight of the classes, from the struggle of the classes, because we want to share in this manner and talk about these different elements. Benjamin, perfect. So let's remember we have different elements: narratives, messages, and communication, so and stories. So let's start talking about narratives. Narratives are not objective. They are not written on the earth or on a from scratch on a blank paper. Narratives are created, are disseminated in a field where there is no equality. This field, in the communication field, it is not even. We all have the same access to the channels in order to convey our information. Same as in the realities that we live every day. In this scope, there is also inequalities that are very clear. There is a struggle for the narratives and for the senses, for the visions. And those voices that are going to appear in the social dialogue are not occupying the same space. Of course, there are some hegemonic narratives, let's call them that way, that may have more power, more channels that are installed with a greater strength. And there are other narratives that will question, that are looking for a transformation, that are looking for, yes, for the transformation, to transform the reality, to work to a different horizon. And there will be other narratives that will create and others that will repeat the stories. There are now some narratives that are going to dignify and some others that are going to eliminate the voices. We know this perfectly, especially in migration. This is very evident. And well, I cannot pronounce your name, but you were sharing with us that two organizations are doing an alliance for domestic workers. In your case, whether national or migrants, and the objective is to demand the compliance of the Agreement 189 in three workshops of national migrants, women migrant. Okay. Perfect. You're sharing with me not only the objective, but also the strategy that you are also constructing in order to reach your objective. Migrant working people, domestic working people, they do not have the same space to talk. They do not have the same space to share their visions. And of course, there are interests also in the communication world. What is very serious with those dominant narratives is that in general, those may talk just an individual story. We can go to the same story of Chimamanda Ngozi, a woman that was from Nigeria and lives in the United States. Actually, you can look for her for this 18-minute video that is in YouTube about the unique narrative. It's very important because she's summarizing a lot of things. Dominant narratives, they will avoid the sense. It will take just one element of the identity, general, the negative one. And what they are doing is actually to crush the identity, to crush down the identity of the people, or the groups that this narrative is talking about, just by taking one characteristic. So, what do I mean by those dominant narratives? Who are taking, or who is telling this story about migration? Who does not have any space to tell the story about migration? Which are the stories? And what they are saying? Which are the stories that they are being said? It's not the migrants, the ones that are giving us a story, but there someone is talking about them. Which are the effects that others may have about migration? Who is the beneficiary, and what they enable, what they restrict, what they are silencing in these narratives? With which narratives we can name the structures that allow the inequality and also the migration and the dislocation, as Benjamin and Isabel was saying. I hope, quite Isabel, I hope that I am pronouncing well your name. Sorry for that. But actually, with which stories we're talking about this inequality that will generate people to being plundered or being uh, thinking about migration, with which narratives migration is named. Here, we did a little gathering of certain narratives that are being shared, of some hegemonic narratives about migration, so that we finish understanding very well the narrative concept. I am not forgetting what you mentioned about your objectives. I'm going back to those. Just I'm gonna develop a little bit more this part, and then we'll go back to your objectives. So, taking these questions into account, we may analyze the existing narratives about migration. Of course, there are a lot more, and it depends on the scopes. There are certain narratives and certain authors, but in general terms, one of the narratives that are repeated about migration is that migrants are victims. But victims, just only and solely victims. Of course, there is a general part that the migrants, maybe because of a balanced situation, economic inequality, there is a part that may in which they could be named victims. But in this type of narrative, all the migrants, it is reduced to just one characteristic. They are victims, and that's it. Another hegemonic narrative about migration: migrants are living from the help of others. They are expecting the other governments to solve them their lives. So each of these narratives, of course, could coexist, but each of them, they are going to have a vision, a perspective of the world. And what is telling us about migrants, this narrative, how they are, what they are doing, what they are looking for, how they react. They are generating something, they are generating a vision about migrants in a childish place, passive place, in a victim place. What I want you to understand is that each of these narratives will mean, if we can break down underneath, will mean a lot of implicit characteristic in those spaces. In the narrative, I'm not saying that it is like this, but in the narrative, it is explained this way. And who is explaining this? There are passive people that are living from the others, that are expecting or waiting for economic resources, material resources, or symbolic resources from the countries where they arrive. The narrative is saying this: the migrants are criminals. This is another narrative that is very strong, in which migrants are not only flying away from violence, but also they may have a criminal background, and obviously they are gonna come to a different country and they're gonna commit the same crimes. In the current context, something that is installed every time with more frequency is that migrants are bringing COVID. They're bringing disease or sicknesses, and basically that. They bring the disease, but also a greater economic impact for all those people that are in crisis. Benjamin is saying the corporate media are the ones that frame the narrative of migrations from the financial capital and transnational capital perspective. I totally agree. By answering the demand and the offer of cheap labor and by using a narrative to victimize the different individuals that are migrating without taking into account the context of the economic policies of the free trade that are concentrating the wealthness in just few hands. Exactly. And this is which effects we have. Has the effect to share the responsibility for the origin countries, and as if there were no regional policies.
that want to criminalize and that provoke guilt. So we're looking for the population, in this case Mexico or any other country, rejects these people and marginalize these people. So those are the questions that we need to ask. Who is benefiting this kind of narrative? And there are so many narratives. We just mentioned the ones that caught our attention. This is another one. Migration is a problem. This is the counter speech. Migration brings richness. And yes, it brings richness to the destiny country or to the host country. And the problem here is that if we are part of those narratives that are discriminating and putting stereotypes on the migration, how can we change these kind of narratives? And what you're telling me is a transformation narrative. Instead of that, it's migration is bringing richness to the host countries, because all of these realities are being silenced. They're being left behind, they're being denied. What is the effect in us and the community when we talk about migration as a problem? What is the effect of that? And precisely what are the visions that we are communicating in regards of migration in front of hegemonic narratives? Why is it important for us to talk about transformative narratives? Well, we don't want to minimize reality or the material conditions that we have. However, we believe that the way in which we talked about our stories has a way to enable them. So once more, the way in which we tell our story has the effect in our capacity to live them. So if we talk about migration not as a problem, but as something that has been happening throughout history, we are going to change narrative. If we focus on money and things like that, we're going to change the narrative. I am a migrant. So if I change my narrative, then I am going to change my story. Yes, migration is a natural phenomenon and that has happened in our history. Yes, that's completely true. This is not a poor country kind of problem. This is a natural phenomenon that has been happening throughout our history. That's why for us, this changing narrative is so important, and it has political hues. Now, the question for our organization is, are we strengthening stories from a place of dignity, or are we feeding those stories that talk about the problem in terms of dominancy? This is something that we see this in the digital field. What are we giving our focus to? Are we giving our attention to only the problems, or are we also giving attention and focus to those other stories that, well, Benjamin, and I am reading Cook, Chabel, and Benjamin. When we talk about violence, inequality, when people are stripped from some of their rights, those things are going to affect and define us as migrants. However, it's important to change that narrative. Maybe, okay, this defines my situation, but doesn't define me as a person. So it's important to detach ourselves from that, to not let that define us. We need to discuss that, yes. We need to give a space to talk about that, yes. But we also need to focus on the richness and the cultural value that we bring. How do we build narratives that discuss power arguments and do not feed the problem only? Well, we need to strengthen those stories from a place of dreams, value, hope. We need that. We are looking for success stories. The power the power speech is so powerful. And sometimes it's hard for us to share those success stories. Julian is asking, when we talk about the word migrant and refugee, do you think that using those words can contribute to the stigma? Well, in the project that I will be sharing with you in a few moments, we open this space for reflection about narratives from migrants themselves. And for us, those words, migrants, refugees, for us, those are not words that are going to contribute to the stigma. So I don't know what you guys think, but we do not believe that words migrant or refugee are stigmatizing or something like that. Maybe if what is contributing to the stigma is the adjective that you give to those words. Okay. As Cook Chabel was saying, for the dominant narratives, we need to reflect on those, and we need to understand which ones are transformative narratives. If they're telling you the migrant people are only victims, they live out of somebody else's help, this is a narrative that is harmful. We need to change that narrative. We need to tell that migrant people are actors, they're in charge of their own lives, that they have personal goals, they have collective goals. Another narrative is migrant people are criminals. This is a very complicated narrative. And every time we are discussing this kind of narratives, we need to pay attention to who is saying those things, because we need to change the narrative and say migrant people are actually honest and solidary people. For this narrative, migrant people bring COVID. Repeating this in any shelter or in any house for migrants, we need to educate people on the protocols that we have. And we need to also start talking about these people, how they take care of themselves, how COVID is a pandemic that is everywhere, that is affecting every single country. Benjamin says, countries, the origin countries are not poor, they're being looted because of the predative model, the capitalism that produces a culture and society that is consumerist. Yes, that's right. We need to, let's say, eliminate this kind of culture in terms of communication, because the responsible ones are those countries that do not have a policy against these kind of things, when the problem is international and that is generating this kind of situation. So yes, it's important to identify this problem, but it's important to differentiate from the problem that is typical from a country versus the problem that you put or that you attach to an individual, and that is where it's not fair. Another narrative: migrants are looking for stolen richness from the countries. Yes, yeah, yeah. This is another message that we have heard, and there's a whole debate behind it. And the challenge is, how do we counteract these kind of narratives? The hegemonic narrative is migration is a problem. So, what would be the counteractive narrative for this one? The northern tourism was a way of transmitting COVID. People who were able to travel from one country to the other, migrants were actually working and contributing to society. Yeah, of course, we can talk about that instead of migrants bring COVID. As Coxabel said, yes, migration brings richness. And this is expressed in our history. Migration brings a lot of cultural, language richness, customs, new of new practices, etc. The narratives and those things that we're building always have to do with those actors or messages that we are responding to. Maria Jose says, I don't think it's because of the capitalism 100%, but because of the corruption in the leaders, the lack of democratic institutions, the monopoly system, and not a healthy competition where everyone can develop their potential. Yes, Maria Jose. The question is, isn't that capitalism? Do you think that capitalism causes these problems like corruption in leadership? So it opens a whole political discussion. So my question was, what is the political view or narrative of our organization? I am not going to tell you which political narrative you need to pick. Everyone is responsible for their own narratives and political views. Cochabel says migration brought bionationality and new encounters. The disorder that was committed against the state promoted from the north, like Honduras in 2009, was a clear example of these migration causes. Well, once more, each one of you has a different view. So those narratives need to be aligned with the narrative that you have commonly in your associations. I am kind of giving you a path, like a general path that we have developed in order to strengthen the most recurrent narratives that we have in our organizations. And there is a key point. Before communicating, we need to just listen. Listen to what's being said about this topic. What are people saying in these spaces where we're working? What are people talking about? In which contexts are they saying these things? Who are creating or who are replicating these kind of narratives? Because not all the time people are creating their own narratives. Most of the time they're just repeating what they have heard. So who are creating these kind of communications? Who are repeating these narratives? This is a path that we have developed in order to identify these things. We need maybe some external counselors to tell us, maybe to do a diagnosis and tell us a list of things that we need to do. But so far, this is what we have. Here, I am not going to spend a lot of time, but these are other tools that we can do, like analyze information, collect information. We have a database. There are many ways to do this. There are many applications, like we have digital spaces and physical spaces, of course, to recognize the most frequent words. Who are saying this? We have different tools to do this. In this case, I am sharing with you digital tools, but you can also go out to your community and just listen to the people. What are people talking about? How are they expressing themselves about certain things? So you can do this in a digital way or in a physical way. Another one is, what we're going to ask to this analysis is, what are the hegemonic narratives? What are the counter hegemonic narratives that we already have in the conversation? And finally, what are those narratives that we can create for ourselves, for women and men within the organizations, as well as for the migrant people? And then that information, you put it into a chart like the one that I am displaying here. I am going to cover this faster because I want to complete my presentation. I just have 15 minutes left. So this is the analysis work. This is the interior of the organization, and we complement that with participation processes. For us, it has been key to understand that in this case, for instance, for the kind of work we're doing, these podcasts along with other organizations that work with migrant people, we found after doing this narrative analysis and using these tools and creating these charts, one of the things that we found is that refugees do not have channels of communication. They don't have the space to share. It's not that they don't have a voice, but they don't have the means to share their story, their voice, and their experience. We saw that in these spaces there were few life stories from these migrants, and that these stories were only about crisis. We only found some stories about crisis. Probably you have the same findings, but these were the two key elements that made us reflect on a process where we didn't want La Sandia to do their research and to tell the stories about asylum seekers and migrants. We wanted to give actually those people their own voice. We didn't want to do that for them. We wanted just to open the space for them to actually speak up. How did we achieve this? Well, first of all, we didn't want to share only stories of crisis, but also all of these enriching stories, the diversity of stories, the capacities that they have, the dreams that they have. We did a narrative report, which is the chart that I showed you before. Then we did a participative script workshop with the migrants, where we wanted to analyze the speech and look for ways to speech. We also defined objectives, and from that participative script, we recorded the podcasts. We had a series of them. We validated the recordings with the migrants. And finally, there's going to be a disclosure or dissemination process. These are some of the pictures from that process, the scripts, the development of the scripts. This was carried out with mothers, migrant mothers. So we needed to open space for them to speak about their issues. These were some of the messages that this group in particular expressed. They wanted to share these. And with that, we created the structure and a script in particular. Chabel says that economic migration is structural. It takes various forms and tends to be crushed in the face of crisis, and does very conveniently that the powers that be maintain a status quo of exploitation and persecution. Yes, of course, we have to denounce what's happening. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but what I'm saying is that if we only focus on those negative things, we are risking focusing only on those things that are in this situation. But there are other people, other migrants that are living the process in a different way. So we need to reflect and ask ourselves what are the narratives that we're hearing, or what are the visions, well, not the visions, the view of the world that we are sharing. This is not about sugarcoating things or showing just a pink glass that the migrants need to look through. We need to take care of our narratives, and that those narratives are going to open a space for the bright side. If we only focus on the negative side, then we are going to victimize these people, and we're gonna risk work with empty people who have been emptied because of the whole background of victimization. And we want to talk about, of course, these people that have suffered inequality, but we also want to talk about people who have experienced other things. Okay, so far I have shared how we are understanding this whole subject of narratives, and how we are defining the different elements that we're working with. And also, so far, we have defined a way in which we can change the narratives. And what I want to tell you is that it's possible for every organization to change the narratives that are linked with the objectives of our organization. Benjamin says in the United States, there is a whole economy of profiting with criminalization and uh, imprisonment of migrant workers. There are private jails or prisons that entrepreneurs or investors run, that are profiting with these people that are detained. Yes, definitely. What do we do? How do we change narratives in order for people to say this is not possible? We cannot allow this as society, because the narratives are pointing there. We can talk about different arguments, about different elements that are contradicting these hegemonic narratives, but many times this is not enough. Even if I post and share numbers, this is not enough. This is not going to have the effect that I'm looking for. If we can put a face to these stories, if we can put a context, then maybe I'm going to create empathy, and I am going to think, okay, I can relate to this person. Maybe we're not so different after all, right? So that's why this is not the only type of work that we do, but yes, narratives is one of the big subjects in our agenda. Of course, it has to be accompanied with legal advice, with education, with civil society organizations as well, and basically put a light on the things that we're doing. Claudia is asking, what are the factors that are facilitating that a new narrative is accepted and replicated? Okay, in our experience, it's key to understand who is going to receive the message, the narrative. It's not the same if you're going to talk about, sorry, if you're going to talk to people who are employers, or to migrants, or to public officials, or teachers, or housewives, or people, children from other countries. It's not the same. You cannot tell them the same thing. Every one of them have a different experience and view of the world. So first of all, you need to understand why people are repeating this hegemonic narrative, understand their context according to the different characteristics of the person, because as we mentioned, it's not the same thing. And then based on their own story and context, you can start building a different narrative for each one of them. But yes, first of all, you need to understand, who are you talking to? How does this person think? What narrative do you think is more suitable for this person? You are not addressing one single audience. You are addressing different sectors of the population. As Benjamin was saying at the beginning of the talk, the state has to guarantee work, I mean, employment, household, etc., all the favorable conditions so that people don't have the need to migrate. So, if we want to achieve that, who are the important people or organizations that we need to talk to? The state, okay, yes, but you know what, the state doesn't move unless there is another organization that is demanding to comply with certain things. And this organization could be the human rights organizations. And what do we do this? What how do we put pressure on the state? Well, first of all, we need to regroup, and we need to start telling the effective narratives. So Claudia, I would say that is the key. Understand what you want to achieve, who you're talking to, who are those key actors in the whole thing, how you're going to open the dialogue with them. This doesn't mean that I am going to start dialogue with Trump, of course, right? It's according to your possibilities. Benjamin says, when the workers are in the power in order to create policies that respect human rights in every neighborhood, in every workplace, in every school. Yes. Okay, so talk about it, Benjamin. Who do you need to talk with in your work? Who do you need to talk about human rights? Who can you talk to about narratives without discrimination? Who are in the same path as you? Perfect. Migrants, migrant workers. And yes, of course, there you will find resistance. But then how do you change that resistance? How do you talk them in? And this, of course, is just an example, but you can do this with all of your organizations. So that is why it is so important to redefine, to update this political view of the things that we want to achieve, and the way we have to do things in order to strengthen these narratives. Otherwise, this will be empty narratives. Okay, so Benjamin is now specifying unions, popular organizations, and if there is not an organization, build one, create one. Yes, this might be the basis for this talk in particular. We are talking about building narratives that are going to accompany this process of transformation. We are convinced that all of these participative communication processes require transformation. When the moment I sit and reflect with other colleagues or friends how to change this. Of course, after this process, I won't have the same thoughts. Something will change. Maybe my own view will change, and how I convey this to other people. So basically, this is a little bit of the experience I wanted to share with you. And this is the digital watermelon, or sandía digital. Cookshabel says public opinion, the hegemonic speech, has categories that exceed the legal. Okay.
Probable that the associations and the conversation will go slower. Many times we achieve to have a change in the laws and then hear the conversation about that topic. Yes, exactly. That we need to change the public opinion, and we're not going to achieve to change it if we don't listen first what is been said, if we do not identify which are the narratives that are being constructed and from where I'm going to discuss them, or how I'm going to argument against them. But it's going to be very different the way, in case we can do this. I thank you a lot for your time and for your engagement in listening. And as I shared in the beginning, the communication diagnosis is free to download. Yes, we need to change the visions of the world that we have. Here is the diagnosis once again if you want to download it and if you want to share it. And probably in 2 months, very soon, we're going to publish another document, a guideline for strategic communication, by developing all these tools that I already told to you today, but in a deeper manner. So, this is another guideline if you want to look it up later on. And thank you very much for listening and for your comments.